Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. Welcome to LinkedIn Speaker Series. We're very excited to have Reid and Matt here today. And before I introduce them, I'd love to just take a couple of seconds to remind everyone what our speaker series is all about. The goal of our speaker series is to bring in innovative thinkers and inspiring ideas, Exhibit A, to LinkedIn to make our employees and our members more productive and successful. You can find all things speaker series related at go/speaker series. That's where you can submit recommendations, you can see upcoming speakers, and you can also view past recorded sessions there. And if you're tuning in on Ustream, if you're not at LinkedIn, we have a public site as well, which is speakers.linkedin.com. Okay. So now on to our event. I'd like to introduce our guests today. First of all, Reid. You may recognize him as the co-founder and executive chairman of LinkedIn. You'd be correct. Reid, I just wanted to thank you so much for being a part of our LinkedIn speaker series. It's always personally a highlight for me when you get to interview one of our guests, as I know it is for our employees. So thank you.
As it is for me.
Oh, thanks. And then Matt Mullenweg, welcome to LinkedIn. Thanks for being here today. How many of you have ever written or maybe read a blog? Okay, look at how many lives you've influenced. Matt is the mastermind behind WordPress, the world's most popular blogging platform. And he's also the founder of Automatic, and you recently took on the role as CEO there. And Automatic is all about they are passionate about making the world too, probably, but the web a better place, right? Okay. So before we get started, just one final reminder. You can share about the content from this session, and the hashtag is up on the screen, but it's in speaker. And then the Twitter handles are @Reid Hoffman and @PhotoMatt. And you know that we can now upload pictures from our LinkedIn mobile app, so I hope to see a lot of that today as well. So with that, I will hand it over to Reid. Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys are really well organized, by the way. This is great. Thank you.
They are. I'll contribute to that. So let's start a little bit about kind of the transformation of the publishing industry and content on the web. And one of the things, and you've been one of the leaders in this, both in the kind of general blogging, which is giving everyone a potential voice, but also, of all the blogging platforms that were started, kind of at the 2001 to 2003 era, you opted for not only being kind of open in the voice, but also open in the software. So you're kind of taking it in two directions. So what's been your, kind of learnings over the last decade about how blogging has evolved? You did actually a post on this maybe about 6 months ago or 4 months ago about the kind of weirdness of blogging getting harder with the shares and LinkedIn and Twitter and whatnot. What's your view about kind of what are the positive and negative lessons of kind of how the voices of people in the publishing industry has changed?
I'll start with positive first. So one of the things that's been great is many people, as you recall, thought that the growth of social networks would kill blogs because all the publishing would happen in these networks. But in fact, what's happened is that the majority of traffic that's coming, the growth in traffic is coming from Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Facebook, these sorts of networks. So they're driving a ton of distribution, which has been really positive, and if anything is reinvigorating blogging. The downside is, like I wrote about, I think that a lot of the conversation that used to happen on blogs has shifted to other places, where people tend to have the conversation with the content where they first were exposed to it. So they respond to the tweet or the people tweeting about it. And what might have been a very rich discussion happening on the site itself, maybe even moderated by the author, is now kind of disaggregated. And sometimes the blog can feel a little bit lonely because it's not bringing in these other conversations and not incorporating them. And then, of course, because blogs typically have a very open commenting system, spam and everything else has been a challenge for them.
Yep. And do you think that there is something, when you look back on the last 10 years, that when you started with the blogging platform, you would have done differently or you would have set up differently, given the evolution?
Yeah, lots of things. Almost everything. things that come to mind, top of mind, would be like how we deal with media. And I still think that's a weak point for WordPress.
By media, you mean like video and...
Video, images, galleries, audio, everything that's not text. We're pretty good at text.
Yes.
Putting, words in and out of a database, we rock at. But beyond that, I think it's a little trickier. And one thing a transition we're making now that I wish we had done 4 or 5 years ago is moving a little bit away from the document model of editing. If you look at most WYSIWYG editors on the web, they tend to have something that looks not unlike Microsoft Word did 15 or 20 years ago. You kind of have these pages and formatting bar at the top, and layout becomes really, really tricky. And I think that a web native editor, which is something we're working on, has maybe more of a block-based approach, where the text is a type of block that maybe you can drag and drop around, but you really have a lot of other rich things that can and should be included. Yeah. So that's some experiments we're doing now, and I'm excited to see where that goes.
So then let's shift from the last 10 years to the next 10 years.
Can I say one more thing
of course.
that I totally forgot about, but is also really important, is WordPress was always about writing and not reading. And this is something I see LinkedIn doing a lot of as well, is say updating your profile or writing a blog post might be something you do a few times a month or a few times a week. But people read blogs every single day. Yes. Across WordPress.com, we get 850 million unique people, over 1 billion cookies. A lot of people are visiting these blogs. And so providing a way for people to have a great reading experience is something that I think we're still figuring out and still working on.
Yeah, I actually think that's kind of super important. And one of the things that it does lead a little bit to, actually, so we'll come back to the future of publishing, so I want to do that, but it's the kind of the open and closed systems, right? Because part of the thing that I thought was super interesting when I saw WordPress launch, because I was part of 6 Apart at the time, and for folks who don't know, I was on the board of 6 Apart, it had this open source movable type, and this was doing actually a cloud service type pad based on it, as opposed to continuing the open source process. And part of the thing that was interesting was, okay, well, where do open patterns work better, and where do closed patterns work better, and where does some fusion of the two work better has been one of the things I've been thinking about a lot. And one of the areas where I actually thought a closed pattern might work better is in the reading experience and generating reading. It's one of the reasons why I actually thought, Facebook and LinkedIn and other things would be like, okay, you have the closed loop on a network. That whole closed loop and being able to develop for it in an effective way was you can kind of control the whole environment. And a reading experience struck me as more relevant there. I don't think it's really played out that way yet. I mean, I actually think the question of what is a good reading experience is still a very open question. Yeah. So do you have any thoughts on the reading experience you can share?
I would say it's definitely much easier when all the content's kind of in your databases to do a lot of things that we think of a reader doing. And famously, Google shut down Google Reader, and a lot of the open systems have been having the whole process there. But I think that is more a function of the environment for how you would do an open reading system. So how RSS readers worked is you'd visit the site, you would somehow point the RSS reader to a service or a desktop client that would then start to pull it regularly. And there were a lot of steps in there. And it wasn't connected to publishing. And I think the best reading experiences are sort of one click away from publishing, just like on Twitter or LinkedIn or any of these. Google is actually back in this, and most people have not noticed in a very interesting way where, who uses Google now? A few folks? It's actually amazing. And when you think about it, the reading lots of feeds or things on the internet is less hard than keeping multiple copies of the internet in memory, which Google does dozens of times over. And so one thing they've started pushing through Google now is they look at websites you visit, presumably in Chrome, through your web history if you have that turned on, and they start to put in Google Now like new posts from those sites. And I found it actually works really, really well. And it just opens the browser. It's not like an integrated reading experience or anything. But I think that's an interesting sort of push. How can you use maybe some of the open stuff that's already out there? We get a ton of email subscriptions still. Like email should be dead at this point. Like it's so terrible in so many ways. But we're getting tens of millions, hundreds of millions of these subscriptions, and people still love them, and they get a really high engagement.
Well, the one benefit email's lots of things to improve. But the one benefit is that in the asynchronous system allows you to pick and choose as you like, and it's an open universe system. I think one of the reasons why email has persisted is because it's one of the open platforms, like the web.
Yeah, and I think that the web needs more attention put into these open platforms because most of the investment and intellectual capital, I think, is going into closed networks right now.
Yeah. Well, the capital loop is the thing that has the benefit to it, but I completely agree. I mean, it's one of the things also, as we talked about a little earlier, was the Firefox is part of the how do you make essentially keeping the web open in the right ways, and yet surprisingly the most interesting kind of competitive themes are Chrome. Right, because you say, okay, here's a system that's being developed in a closed loop, and here's one that's being developed in an open network, and that those are kind of the two leading contenders for what is the most interesting kind of browser experience.
Although Chrome is open source, just like Firefox.
Yes, although it doesn't really does it allow open development the same way?
It is. There's probably some distinction there, but also the majority of contributions to Mozilla products now are from Mozilla employees. So you get one of these things where there's been sort of an intellectual capture where you had sort of this lucky thing. I don't know if this is actually a story, you can correct me, but search generates a ton of revenue, which has been sort of a closed loop investing in all of Mozilla's open source products. Is that
yes.
pretty accurate?
Yes, that is accurate.
So they were able to capture this one thing that generated a ton of revenue and then invest that back in. But the danger when you do that is that for an open source project, you take all the oxygen out of the room. So if there's 100 people contributing to your project and you hire 95 of the good ones, or some plurality of it even.
Do you have a thought on what you would do to add more oxygen back in the room for Mozilla and Firefox?
You need, I think, at the heart of Chrome is WebKit, and WebKit has several large companies contributing to it on roughly equal terms. And that's really interesting. And so that's one of the things, I think of that with regards to WordPress, is what are the other big enterprises besides Automatic that can contribute to WordPress and get as independent economic actors acting rationally will make this thing we call WordPress much better over time rather than tear it asunder. And so web hosting companies make hundreds of millions of dollars from WordPress, for example. GoDaddy's, Bluehost of the world. Publishing companies, New York Times, CNN, Wired.com is 100% WordPress. New York Post is 100% WordPress. Like as people start to, maybe the $5 million they wasted on a crappy CMS before, put 500,000 into 3 or 4 good developers or 5 or 6 good developers just working on the core software, and that'll have a much bigger return because they're working together with a larger community. So for Mozilla, the question might be, who else would benefit from an open browser, and how can you sort of share some of that technical?
Share the developer investment across multiple entities.
Although maybe there's a technical barrier where being on its own rendering engine is going to prevent that.
It's interesting. I will relay that to the Mozilla folks if they haven't seen this. And I think they have some thoughts along these lines. I mean, part of the thing that you may or may not be tracking with Mozilla is that as interesting as the pattern of open closed is on the desktop, it's more closed on mobile, right? Because of all the OSs. And so one of the things that has actually been a principal kind of mission over the last few years for Mozilla and Firefox has actually been like, let's try to make sure that the mobile keeps some open characteristics. That's part of what made the internet and the web so great, and that's been their primary focus. And they have more of the collaborative organizational focus on that part of it.
Another interesting direction is to take the money from, take the investment and not just put it back into the software, but put it into services. And the nice thing when a company, I think actually Apple could be the most interesting web services company in the world because they don't make money from web services. So because they make their money other places, they could make radically open, interacting with everything web services and not really lose anything. Where a network like Google or someone else sort of has an incentive to keep more of the activity in their ecosystem so they can monetize it.
And like if you were to pick one web service for Apple to do that, what would it be?
I would go all the way foundational, like iCloud, for example, the storage layer. There's no reason a developer would adopt that unless if you want to work beyond iOS devices. What they did with iTunes is really interesting. We're putting on Windows as well. If I'm a developer, I'm going to use Imperium or Dropbox to do device synchronization of data and storage. Why not iCloud? Why not something else?
The other one that actually could be interesting is since they have a strong interest in this, is leading the charge on maps, right? Because obviously one of the things it'd be better if there were multiple providers of maps for the overall ecosystem. As obviously as awesome as the Google Maps products are, the ecosystem is better off with multiple providers, and that might be another one to do.
Maybe
that.
on OpenStreetMaps. There are open source things out there that if they started to put some of the money that they would have spent buying Waze, for example, into that, it could be really interesting.
Yes.
The worst thing about iOS is the defaults, or the lack of control over the defaults. My favorite thing on Android is just when I click a map, it opens Google Maps. When I click a link, it opens Chrome. And I have all these apps on my iPhone.
Yes.
It launches Safari and crappy Apple Maps and all these other things by default.
Yep. Well, that's the classic platform dilemma. Back to the future of publishing. So what do you think? The last 10 years, kind of focus on, what more focus on reading experience. We're coming to the next 10 years of kind of publishing content. There's a set of different, I think, interesting things beginning to happen, which also play in this open and close. You've got, Medium. You've got, a whole bunch of stuff happening on mobile with Flipboard. Kind of, what are your thoughts as prognosticating the future is always a dangerous thing. What is it? What is the expression? Predictions are hard, especially about the future. Right. But what's your thought about the next 10 years of how kind of the future of online content goes, what it means for people's freedom, what it means for publishing industry, what it means for technological development?
Yeah, well, there's also the best way to predict the future is to invent it, right?
Yes, exactly. Alan Kay.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about where we think these things are going. Medium is a beautiful product, and I think really did some cool innovations on the editor side. Long term, I don't know if there's a long-term sustainable advantages because the rest of the ecosystem is catching up quickly. But if you think of what's inherent to the product that will be around 10 years from now, regardless of what happens, is the distribution. The idea that Medium can be known for great long-form content and can take readers from one thing and sort of convert them to reading other great things. In some ways, that looks more like a media company than it necessarily does a publishing platform. The publishing platform is more of a means to an end rather than it's an inherent differentiator to other things. And so it has a lot in common with how I understand the new LinkedIn platform works for publishing, Huffington Post, where there's contributors that sometimes get elevated to other things. And that's a cool model. And I'm interested to see, Ev and I share a passion for long form. We both agree that man cannot live on 140 characters alone, And so I want to see a little bit more in the world.
Although that is less than 140 characters, but yes.
Well, aphorisms are easy, right?
Yes,
because they don't actually say anything.
Well, it's just hard to say everything in aphorisms. You can say some interesting things in aphorisms.
Actually, one of my favorite books of the past few years is Nassim Taleb's book of aphorisms. Is it Procrustes, or how do you say that? Is it said Procrustes?
Huh.
It just sounds weird, but the bed of Procrustes.
Funny. I've actually, his Anti-Fragile is one of the books I've been reading, but I actually haven't read Procrustes, so I'll need to do that.
It's a quick one, where Anti-Fragile took me a long time to get through, just because it was dense and he had a lot of, he really likes himself. But he's one of my favorite writers in the world.
Yeah. Actually, highly recommended. You have to get through the self-promotional, the I am great parts of it, because there's some really fundamentally important ideas in it.
Yeah. But then this, you're able to get through. It's essentially a book of tweets.
Yes. Yes, funny. I wonder if he would think of it that way. So back to the kind of medium for a brief minute. One of the categories of companies that I think actually hasn't been fully developed, which is always kind of the category which I thought about Yahoo last decade, is a category of techno-media companies. Right? Because people say, well, is a technology company or is a media company? And you're like, okay, well, actually, in fact, there may be this third category that's this fusion that's super important. Because if you look at it, a lot of media tends to be powered by what is newly available technologies anyway. So it's like, well, now we can do film, and now we can do TV, and now we can do radio. And this creates kind of media companies. And what happens in those things is when it's just a media company is when the technology actually is actually extraordinarily stable and not really evolving very much. Because you say, okay, great, we have high def now. Yeah, that's
printing presses haven't had any step functions.
Yes, exactly. Whereas actually, I think part of what's happening, especially with software and with kind of technological change, is you end up with this kind of category of a techno-media company, which is actually, in fact, the technology loop itself is evolving. And so, yes, we have a media as a focus. We may have advertising as our primary, economic model. We may have, audience share as kind of the way that we're, kind of valued and thought about and kind of how we're progressing. But actually, the fact that technology is a central part of it because of how the technology is evolving the medium. And so, I've actually, for example, if I were to say, what do I think Medium is, I would think it's a techno-media company because the technological clock of how it's evolving, if it doesn't do that effectively, it won't be an interesting media company. It'll have to do that as part of it. Even if it attracts, we are the best kind of general, long-form, thoughtful things about, art, culture, and everything that you would find,
Well, the platform certainly does have to evolve.
Yeah.
Do you see LinkedIn as a technology or a media company, especially in the direction it's going to?
So I see LinkedIn as a technology company where the network and identity are the key platform. And then the question is, in terms of the apps on top of it, is which of those apps are kind of on-premise built and which of them are done in kind of collaboration with others. In publishing, I don't think that it's likely we're going to own all of the business content. I don't think that all of interesting business, I think there's enough different sources of interesting business content. And our primary focus is on you as an individual professional. What's the news that you need today in order to operate effectively? And a network and identity for curating that, for targeting it, for getting the right promotion. Now what happened is the team recognized, they said, well, actually, in fact, that creates a really interesting platform by which people can begin to publish themselves. And given that we have a business context, how do we essentially say, for example, business leaders who say, look, I do actually want to build a business followership, and I want to speak specifically in this context. And then that actually creates a really effective loop using relevancy and identity and networks as a way of targeting it. And we actually was one of our venture projects. We break into kind of core, expand, and venture projects as a way of doing it. It was one of the venture projects. Let's try this and see how it goes.
Oh, cool.
And then we got a lot of demand for it. And so now it's moving into the core.
What is Expands?
Expands is usually you take
you guys probably know this.
Yes.
Sorry.
You essentially take something that's an immediate adjacency to the things you're doing and is a natural extension to, so for example, Treasury, which is putting richer content on your profile. So you can be able to put
Gotcha,
PowerPoint presentation and so forth, would be that this is just a natural, we have to do this. It's a natural next step to the things that we're doing. It isn't just simply doing the .1 feature or the kind of, but it's actually extending the area, right? And so that's the sort of thing that.
That's a cool framework. I like it.
It's a way to kind of divide out resources and make sure you're investing in all three. So, for example, one of your cross checks is: do we have enough venture bets for the future? Are we being aggressive enough on not just building on our strengths? These sorts of things, and it gives you a way of balancing a sense of how are you investing your resources in terms of how are you inventing the future.
And to take it back to techno-media companies, I think what's interesting is that essentially WordPress is a shared bet from a lot of these companies that developing something together will have a better input than maybe the enterprise things they did before or the purely in-house things. If you think of Gawker, Huffington Post, they've really evolved a lot of their own publishing systems. But long-term, are those the cultures and environments that are going to bring in together the best technologists in the world and have the most investments as a single publishing platform, as maybe an open source thing or even a closed source product like maybe Adobe CQ5 or something that might be able to really draw together better technology. Just like LinkedIn is a place where some of the best technologists in the world find an interesting mission and place to work. Applied to publishing, could do some really cool stuff.
Yes. So let's actually go to how you build WordPress, because actually one of the things that's interesting is, LinkedIn's a global company, but we're not global quite the way you guys are global in terms of a completely distributed work environment. And one of the funny things about, for example, visiting your offices, you come in your office, you go, We're in San Francisco. Where is
right. You were there.
Yeah, where is everybody? Right, and it's taking the massively distributed as a company super seriously. So what have the lessons been? What are the things that again, kind of one of the ways I look at it is kind of positive and negative learnings. Like how do you describe it for people because they may not know how you guys run, and then kind of what you've learned about how running that way over the last 10 years.
It was a very natural evolution out of the open source project. So if you think of how the best open source projects in the world work, it's typically not people who happen to be geographically co-located. They're combined by a passion or a mission and brought together, and then they collaborate using the internet as the native medium. Like the center of gravity is on the web, not on any given office or anything. So when we started to build the company out of the open source project, I didn't really see any reason to change that. Also driven by some constraints of, we didn't really have a ton of money. Moving people to one of the most expensive places in the world seemed, as a first principle, not the smartest thing to do when you're limited on capital. And people were happy already. And so if you're optimizing for employee happiness, if someone is happy in their current situation, maybe keep that stable while you're going crazy on the work side. Introduce as few variables into the process as possible. The stresses on family and everything else when you move across the country.
Yep.
So we just started distributed, and it's kind of funny because at very smart advisors actually, at almost every stage have told me that's going to break at some point. It's going to break at 15 because that's more people than you can kind of keep track of at once. It's going to break at 50 because that's when it's more than kind of a single group, and then 150. Dunbar's number
must be a breaking point.
Must be a breaking point. And the next one people are saying is 300. Something happens at 300 that will cause it all to fall apart. But right now we're about 230, 235, and it works fantastic. Primarily people work from home, but we're not we're basically location agnostic is the way I like to think of it. Just like, today it seems silly to discriminate on the basis of something like gender, not just morally, but also mathematically. You're taking off half the qualified applicant pool, so just by selection bias, you're going to have a less qualified people that you hire. Yep. 99.999% of the people in the world aren't going to be in the Bay Area. There's a lot of smart people not here.
Yes.
Arguably, collectively, more intelligent than the people who are here. So if we stop discriminating on the basis of location, what happens? And it turns out that you can get incredibly talented and smart folks who can almost lifestyle arbitrage a little bit, sort of Bay Area salaries with maybe, not Bay Area living. Kind of what we all know. Like if you wanted to move to Sacramento, you can get a sweet place.
You'd have to want to move to Sacramento, but yes.
Right? But there's lots of, the Bay Area is gorgeous. It has so many natural resources as well that make it an amazing place to be. A lot of people do choose to be here. Could be anywhere. There's other nice places in the world as well.
Sure.
Literally in the world, like Cabo or Buenos Aires, Hawaai.
Do you have an employee in Cabo?
We don't, but I was just there for my birthday, and I thought,
You may acquire one.
Maybe we're doing this wrong.
Yes.
No, really think about that. Like, people are trying to build startup hubs in like New York and Detroit and like, why go there? Go someplace like Cabo or like Hawaii. Or maybe it's just too distracting there.
Good.
Like with the warmer weather, it's just a little bit too distracting from work. But
So it can't all be roses. There's got to be challenges as well. What do you think of the challenges in the location agnostic?
I think you hit a lot of the challenges that you get when you're larger. You just hit them earlier, which I would argue is almost an advantage because you tackle them earlier. From a technical level, WordPress was actually very lucky in that our first hosting provider, we bought 8 servers. I wasted a ton of money buying these 8 servers. And then when we were ready to move beyond that, because we filled them up, they were like, oh, we don't do that anymore. So I had to, just on my credit card, put a couple servers someplace else. I couldn't get 8 because we couldn't afford that. So we got like 3 someplace else, and we kind of had to start replicating the site between these 2 data centers and serving traffic out of both. It turns out that that's really hard. And there's a ton of bugs that are inherent in that process, and caching becomes really difficult, and cache invalidation. And so we solved a lot of these problems when we were small and no one noticed. And so as we got larger and larger, we were just sort of natively in multiple data centers, and that provided a very robust infrastructure. I think it's the same thing with Teams. So, the problems that you might reach when you guys have an office here, you said Sao Paulo and all these different places around the world, I'm sure that there's projects that span those offices. And communication between those time zones and those sets of people and everything become really important. And if anything, you have it a little bit harder because it's kind of like, the conference call rule where you don't want like 5 people in the room and 2 people on the conference call. Because 2 people on the conference call are playing solitaire, or I guess Flappy Birds, the modern day equivalent. But if you can have everyone on the call equally, it's sort of a level playing field, and everyone's participating in the same way, and arguably will be more engaged. So by having everyone sort of equally distributed, it forces the communication to happen online and in a transparent way, where I think it is difficult to have one person that's remote or a team that's split between 2 places, because there's a lot of things that happen. In person is incredibly high bandwidth.
Yes.
We see each other's expressions, their eyes, the tone of voice, we're talking. And honestly, our weakness, because you asked for those, so I should say there's many. One of them is that we're very text biased, meaning that we'll probably spend 45 to an hour and a half, 45 minutes to an hour and a half typing something that maybe could have been a 10-minute phone call. And it's just we just have a strong bias towards this textual communication that I think we should try to get away from, because the tools like Skype and Google Hangouts are really good now. But I do believe that this can work, and I see it scaling. I mean, part of the reason I became CEO is like I'm interested in scaling this from 200 people to 2,000 and 20,000, and I don't see any reason why it can't work.
Yep.
Like if you look at the reasons, besides we've done it before, what are the reasons to have people physically co-located in the same place that are working on the same thing? Collaboration, communication, brainstorming.
Yeah, I think there's also something about ideation loops.
Ideation loops, yeah.
Right, it's brainstorming, but...
And are the ways to do that distributed? Or does that need to be 365 days a year? Like, do you need to have an ideation loop all the time? Or maybe you can I think of it like, we do meetups. So we found that once a year we bring the whole company together, and I encourage teams, which are typically 5 to 10 people, to get together 2 or 3 times a year. And so that's where they have these very intense in-person sessions of like the ideation loops. And that can kind of give you enough work to do for the next 3 or 4 months. Or maybe even a year. You don't need that every day.
Yep.
And in fact, choosing to physically co-locate with another human being is a very deliberate decision that if you're marrying someone, you think a lot about. But when you're just kind of in a company, you're kind of plopped next to people. And maybe they eat something smelly for lunch every day. Or they talk on the phone really loudly. Or, there's all sorts of things with being next to each other, which are hard.
Yeah.
And so if you can remove that, I think you remove a lot or most of the politics, especially if you think of politics as the division of scarce resources, like who has the office next to the bathroom and doesn't want that, or who gets to place with the windows.
Yeah.
If you're able to remove those, a lot of those interactions become friction-free, and then when you do get together, like a family reunion, you like everyone. You can put up with anyone for a week. And so you can have very strong affection for people that if you were next to each other every day, you might drive each other crazy. But when you see each other a few weeks a year, you can really have a good time together.
It's provocative thoughts. One particular aspect of this that I thought was super interesting was how you also do an internal loop of using WordPress as the communications vehicle and having essentially a stream of WordPress updates being the kind of the communication architecture between the distributed workforce. Is there anything about that that's interesting to share?
Yeah, I mean, there's people are surprised by how little email there is in Automatic. I get maybe 5 to 10 emails from automaticians a week, and that's normally like HR-related stuff. Like not even, it's just things that would be awkward to have publicly. But everything else is on these sort of private, internal public blogs. We use a thing called P2, and the idea is just that, well, think of what is the purpose, what do we use email for? Well, communication. And what are the downsides of that? Well, it allows anyone to interrupt you, and it kind of goes in your queue. There's a lot of, it's kind of private and locked in. By definition, it's your inbox. So let's say you've been working on something for a year. I now join that project. Like, do you forward me all the email communications from the past year? Do I assume that the document that you've created actually represents the richness of the dialogue that's happened over the product over the past year? Let's say we're meeting with someone. Like, there's probably a Reid Hoffman tag in our internal blogs. And it would have a record of, well, just every time I got together with you, when I wrote up those notes, I would post them to one of our internal blogs and then tag it. And then if someone was meeting with you a year from now, they could go back and they could say, oh, almost like a CRM. And so think of it like a CRM for all of your information and data and projects. by having everything public, searchable, tagged, and the ability to have rich media in it very easily, you could do some really cool stuff.
Do you know of other companies that are also using WordPress as a...
Well, a ton of companies are doing it. It's just not with WordPress. So if you think of what Yammer does or Socialcast or any of these systems, they're essentially versions of this. We're trying to move the center of gravity for communications to something that's open within the company, from email, which isn't. So we're actually redoing this system. Currently it's called P2, which has no meaning. It doesn't stand for anything. And we're switching it to O2, oxygen. And because we say oxygen is... our communication is oxygen for a distributed company. Like literally, without it, you die. So we're doing sort of a new version of this. And so if you check out get02.com, you'll be able to use it in a few months.
Oh, cool. I will check it out. It'll be interesting. So back to the future of publishing, because actually there's a few points there that I think are interesting in terms of how you're thinking about this. What do you think the future of... Do you think that the long form, kind of written word, will it diminish? Will it persist? What are the things that will allow the dialogue to be kept more thoughtful, right? In terms of, the thing is actually you want people thinking, you want people learning, you want people communicating the right way. Is the explosion in media, is video, is tweet short form, is that going to drown it? And are there things that should be done by interesting companies as a way of keeping kind of long form more relevant?
Yeah, I mean, every time there's been a new medium, people think that, radio is going to kill newspapers and TV is going to kill radio and YouTube is going to kill TV, and you sort of assume. But often what happens is that the medium falls to a steady state. So radio still going. And perhaps the technological means of transmission will change, but something like radio will probably be around for a long time to come. I think that meatier chunks of content that are consumed visually, so read, is going to be with us for a very, very, very long time to come. Because I love books, because a book, you get a distillation of sometimes their life's work into something you can consume in a matter of hours, maybe a few dozen hours, but still a matter of hours. And pound for pound, that's almost one of the most valuable distillations you can possibly get. Versus a tweet, which maybe took someone 10 seconds to write and takes you 5 seconds to read. The ratio is much lower there in terms of time put into writing versus production versus consumption. So I am a strong believer in long form and book and written content as something that's at the core of human communication for a long time to come. Conversations, are great, but there's some things, like maybe some of these questions you've asked me, I'd really love to write a response to. I could really think about it, and I could throw it around to some people, and I could sort of, really work on it. And I know you love writing, and so I assume you do because you're a good writer. But
well, I love both. So. I have more questions, but after this question, if there are questions from the audience, I will open it up from the audience so that people can line up, and someone's probably collecting it from the remote offices.
Can I say one more thing about future publishing?
Yes.
In a lot of ways, blogs and websites are to automatic what maybe books were to Amazon. They're the first thing that we're doing and we're building on our platform. But I think what's interesting is when you have kind of a web operating system, we have a 21% market share now on the web of websites. Number 2 is 3%. As you start to get more and more of the web on this open platform that is truly open source, that's developed by a number of companies, what can you build on top of that that's interesting? And so our original mission was to democratize publishing. I started adding 2 words to that, to democratize publishing and development, because I think that there's a lot that could be done when you think of everyone as a coder, everyone with the ability to create the web as well as consume it. To me, that's where I get most excited and passionate about the future of the open web, especially in a world of predominantly closed mobile platforms and everything else.
Well, that's a great lead into the question, actually, because I was going to ask you about the 4 freedoms,
okay.
which is precisely where you were going. Because your recent essay, I thought, was a really good articulation of some of the issues, saying, look, these are some of the virtues of having good open systems relative to creating good software, good ecosystems, and this is a virtue that we need to develop and maintain. would you care to share a little bit about your post and what the reactions have been and how you think about it?
Sure. One thing that's been interesting is that, when I got into this, open source was very controversial. And, Microsoft was actively working against it, and there were sort of like people trying to kill open source. It was, if you're a business adopting open source, it was seen as maybe not like a very safe thing. And that's gone away. Open source won, but at the same time, everyone stopped talking about it. Like, there's not a modern company that isn't really built on open source. Even Microsoft sponsors a ton of open source development now. Like the days that people thought pigs would fly. So it's won.
Apple's probably the holdout.
Apple has a ton of open source at its core. At the core of OS 10, WebKit. The iOS has a ton of open source in it, but we're not talking about it. And obviously, they don't produce as much as I think any of us would like. I got into it for the philosophy. Like the reason that I believe in open source is I believe it is the only moral way to create software. And you can think of, a good analogy might be, think of like different companies, like different countries. Like it's cool to look around the world and see different approaches to governance and politics and everything, and the results they have, given a set of natural resources and everything like that. Like maybe there's countries that get very lucky. They're on top of, trillions of dollars of natural resources, so they just kind of get things for free. And there's companies that sort of stumble upon like something that's just so compelling, regardless of how they run it, it would be a really successful thing. So just like there's different ways to run countries, I think one of the best ways to run a country is, or the least bad, is a democracy. And one of the keys to our democracy is the Bill of Rights. I think that software can have and should have a Bill of Rights. And that in the long term, maybe that's hundreds of years, that the most successful products and software and companies will be ones that have kind of a Bill of Rights type thing at their very core. So the 4 freedoms of the GPL, which is the open source license that I'm really into, are the freedom to use the software for any purpose. You can sell it, you can give it away, you can write hate speech on it, you can not. The freedom to see how the software works, so like peek under the hood, and it's not a black box. The freedom to modify it, so you can change how that works, and then the freedom to distribute those modifications. And when you get those 4 things together, you essentially have a system where, as more and more of our lives are governed by our software, like we're literally becoming almost like accessories to the network rather than the other way around. Like our phone buzzes, and we tense up. Like there's physiological changes that happen. I want that world to be governed by these freedoms as well. I completely agree, and we see many examples of, in the short term, closed systems or proprietary systems where we're sort of in someone else's realm, or sometimes I call it being a digital sharecropper, can be very advantageous. But in the long term, people who trade freedom for convenience, I think will end up with neither. And those platforms will not prosper over decades.
Well, I think actually, just in contrast, I actually think that in some places open that way will prosper, some places closed will prosper, and some places will be interesting fusions. My actual view is all 3 actually have different situational patterns by which they work effectively, but I completely agree with you that the open one is under-commented, and actually, in fact, still has a lot of interesting legs to it.
Well, I think I would completely agree with you and call it a timeline sub 30 years. But when you go beyond that, I mean, think of how hard it's been for technology companies to maintain relevance over that period of time, or something like a Microsoft. It's not necessarily that an open competitor might kill them, but it might be an open system. It might be the Wikipedia to their Encyclopedia Britannica. And so I totally 100% agree that hybrid systems or closed systems can prosper for long periods of time, but maybe even layer. Like maybe you just sort of tack one on another and that you're shifting businesses and you can go on for hundreds of years. But think of like the timeline of like the history of America.
Well, the way that to argue the counterpoint slightly, it's how the capital reinvestment loops work. So there's a persistence in the open one, but if the capital reinvestment loop is not happening, this is like a lot of open source projects actually quasi-die on this. So in each of these 3, it's how does the capital reinvestment loop work?
Well, and that's what's cool about the GPL, is that it's kind of a copyright hack, right? It's sort of, it all comes back to economics, right? Are the independently motivated actors going to be driven towards the best goal for the world? And often in the short term, not. You get sort of tragedies of the commons in software and all the time. And so, but with the GPL, you have, and there's loopholes that you can drive a truck through in it, but like, you say that if you modify and distribute the software, you have to make those modifications available under the same freedoms that you got it. So it says that anyone who builds on top of the platform has to make their improvements available to everyone. So you do get a situation where perhaps, we'll see if it works, the New York Times and New York Post, lifelong blood competitors, are sort of making the same thing better at the same time.
Yep, exactly. So with that, we go to questions.
I've noted
What's your
the
name?
conversation. I'm Kurt Anderson. I'm with the site reliability team here at LinkedIn. A lot of the conversation has pivoted around the question of open and closed in various different ways here. Unfortunately, WordPress and other CMSs have become a vector, if you like, for hosting organizations to be attacked and to emanate a lot of badness onto the internet. Do you have any thoughts about what you might do differently or how you would structure that so that maybe naive users would be less susceptible to being attacked in that way or providing vectors?
Totally. And this really started to shift for me 5 or 6 years ago when I began to think of WordPress not just as an application, but a platform, or more like an operating system. It honestly has a lot more in common with a Windows or iOS or an Android than it does with an app like a WhatsApp or something. So when you think of what makes operating systems stable over the long term, the most important thing is people being on the latest version, right? I can fix a bug in, let's say, the security problem. I can fix it and release something tomorrow. In fact, we don't even try to bundle the security updates because we're not worried about the bad press. We don't do them every Tuesday or once a month or something. We get them out there as soon as possible. But if you're going to be on a version from a couple of years ago, or your hosting account is configured to not distinguish between different users or different things, you're going to get hacked. And what we had was create a situation. You remember we had this famous 5-minute install. Like, we got a lot of people able to install it, but they were taking on the responsibility of essentially being sort of like a mini systems administrator. Like, you have the responsibility to keep the software up to date and everything. And especially in the beginning, it was difficult to update. You might lose your customizations or things like that. So if you look at the biggest features that have developed in WordPress over the past 10 years, things like the plugin system, the theme system, they're essentially mechanisms to allow the kernel to be always up to date on the latest version while allowing your customizations to persist. As of 3.7, we have an auto-update system in WordPress. So the core will auto-update itself now as a first step towards Skynet.
Hopefully not as a first step towards Skynet, but yes.
But the other thing we started doing simultaneously, I started doing a few years ago, was working with the hosting providers. So we now have very close partnerships with GoDaddy and all of the AIG hosts, so Bluehost, StreamHost, Media Temple, all these guys, that to say that if you're going to one-click install WordPress, you need to auto-upgrade everyone who you did that for, because otherwise you're just irresponsible towards the internet. And we found that people on the latest version, the software can be incredibly secure. There's an argument that says open source software is less secure because people can read the code. I think the opposite, that many eyes make all bugs shallow, and that we can fix things quickly.
Unfortunately, the plug-in mechanism seems to be one of the popular ways to infect and poison the otherwise good well.
Yeah. Well, there's malware. So you search for WordPress themes. It's something we work with Google a lot on. Sometimes some of those themes you download have backdoors in them, like actual malicious backdoors. And with plugins, it's often less malicious. It's just maybe not being the best coder or something like that. They leave a hole. Again, those are applications on the platform. So first and foremost, I want to see how I can keep them as updated as possible. Like, I'm not going to assume that I can solve what no one has ever solved before and create bug-free software or an environment for bug-free software. I'm going to assume that there will be problems, and what will keep us robust in the long term, anti-fragile, is the ability to update very quickly and have these problems be self-contained, hopefully. So we are doing core updates first. Next, we'll do language updates. Third, we'll do plugin updates, and then finally do theme model updates. This will take us a couple years, just because of the architecture of WordPress. And you break someone's site once, and they lose all trust for your update system. But we aspire towards a Firefox or Chrome model, where you're just kind of, who cares if you're using WordPress 3.0 or 4.0 or 10.0? Like, you should just be using WordPress today. That's how LinkedIn works. That's how Facebook works. Like, you don't care about which version of the software you're logging into. And that's how, if we can get distributed software to work that same way, across these, multitude of hosts across thousands of servers, I think that's a really powerful platform to build on. And distribution mechanism as well.
So let's ask both of these questions at the same time so we get to both answers. So
Oh,
ask
sorry.
ask your question, and then the next gentleman ask your question as well, and then we will answer
Hey,
both.
my name is Sasha Ofsani. I'm with consumer engineering. And first of all, thanks very much for coming and for your insights. It's really interesting. So my question is more continuing on the engineering side of things theme. So what of the engineering choices you made in the beginning of the company, could you talk to some of those? Which of these choices worked well, and which you would do differently now?
Okay, and do we want to get the next question?
Yeah, let's get the next.
Before that, can I make a question to LinkedIn as a company? For those of you watching,
Always.
it's actually a feature request.
Well, go right ahead. You have the mic.
There's LinkedIn skills, right? And one of those is WordPress with a capital P, and one of those is WordPress with a lowercase p.
We can get on top of that one.
If we could combine that to the uppercase P, that would be very much appreciated.
And then ask the next question as well, so we make sure we get to both.
Sure. Hi. My name is Will. I'm a web developer. I work with our marketing arm of LinkedIn. We use a variety of CMSs regularly. First, I just wanted to say thank you for about a half decade of being able to put food on the table for myself.
Oh, cool.
Using your platform. And it was also the leverage where I got into the job here because of the knowledge I gained while working on WordPress.
Cool.
My question is, coming from the marketing arm, what are some of the most interesting ways people have monetized their WordPress installs, be it either fully custom, anywhere on WordPress.com, things like this? I always know about subscribing, subscription models and advertising, but there's a plethora of other ways to monetize content in long form. What are some of the most interesting ways that you've seen it done?
Yeah.
2 questions, either order.
I'll try to go through both quickly. The monetization, as we get larger and larger, it just starts to look like websites in a large degree. I think, I forget who said this, but most people make more money because of their blog than necessarily from their blog. Just like your work with WordPress helped you get a job, a great job at LinkedIn, you might be making more from that than you would if you had run ads on your blog or something like that. So often the non-monetary benefits from publishing tend to be more. And like one of my favorite publications is Next Draft. And they're kind of going towards a patronage model, actually, that we sponsor. I love this site, so we sponsor. I think it's very fascinating to see what Glenn Greenwald, or even what Jeff Bezos might do with Washington Post, where I think we're entering an era where advertising is becoming so unbundled that perhaps that model is less sustainable in the long term for people who aren't networks with hundreds of millions of audience. And so perhaps a patronage model is kind of what the next 30 or 40 years of media looks like. The technical decisions, the 2 that I'm most thankful for is one that we chose PHP. I know people have mixed opinions of PHP, but it's that terrible thing that just works everywhere. And the fact that every single web host in the world, the $3 a month GoDaddy account has PHP and can run WordPress beautifully, MySQL as well, is really, really powerful. And there's been competitors that, honestly, I think are better in some ways, and ones that get created to this day, like Ghost is the latest that runs on Node. And just because of the technological platform, aren't able to gain the distribution, which then has the network effects of plugin developers and everything like that. And 2 would be having one platform across all of our products. So it's something, and this was in contrast perhaps to 6apart, where at one point we looked at them and said they had a TypePad platform, a LiveJournal platform, a movable type platform, and then a Vox platform. They were all publishing, but they were distinct code bases. And we sort of looked at it and said, is there a way we can figure out how to make WordPress work for the personal blogger on the $3 a month GoDaddy account? And then as we build this web scale thing, WordPress.com is a top 10 website in the world, can it run the exact same software that you can download from WordPress.org today? And we've done it. And it's been harder in some ways. And we certainly developed ways to replicate databases, and we have a separate system for search now and things like that. But the fact that you can do that at all scale, from the 1 user to the hundreds of millions of users, I think is really great for the platform and for people building on it.
Okay, with that, I think we will thank you. It's awesome having you here.
Reid.
Yes, Jeffrey.
Thank you. Another round of applause for both Reid and Matt. Thank you. Thanks for coming to the speaker series, and we will see you next month.